for joining us today for Armchair Historians. I'm your host, Anne Marie Cannon. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. You can also find us at armchairhistorians.com. Armchair Historians is an independent and to date ad-free podcast. Won't you consider supporting the show by buying us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi or become a patron through Patreon? Links provided in episode notes. Today, I am talking to Frank Young from Bangor, Maine. Frank has dedicated his career as a steward of the land with the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, Department of the Interior in the American West, BLM for short. His management roles with BLM has shifted throughout the years and have included areas concerning mining law, forest management, mining claim administration, and Alaskan Native land rights. Frank is also the founding member and chair of Clear Creek County Open Space Commission, where he has volunteered for 20 years. His interests include conservation, public lands history, outdoor adventure, and good food and conversation. This interview is part one of a two-part series about the great American experiment with homesteading in the American West. Frank Young, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Good morning, Anne-Marie. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so, we just get right into this. I asked the question, what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
My favorite history at the moment is homesteading in the American West. That's a pretty broad subject, but...
Well, yeah, but, a lot of people don't know anything about it. So what does that mean, homesteading? I was thinking about that before we started talking.
In the United States, most of the western lands west of the Mississippi River were lands owned by the federal government. And they were acquired by various means by the government at the time, such as the Louisiana Purchase, that the United States purchased land claims, essentially, that were held by France. There were lands acquired through treaties with Mexico. There were lands acquired by treaties with Native American tribes, etc. So there was a whole lot of ways the federal government acquired lands. Essentially, the western lands from the Mississippi west to the coast of the Pacific Ocean. So, and the intent of the government in the 1860s was to get these lands settled, get some of these lands into private hands, and then get them settled mainly by farming, because at the time agriculture and mining were the two major activities. So in the 1860s, laws were passed where individuals could acquire and own this government land by establishing a home on it and farming the land. So that's where the term homesteading came from.
So homesteading specifically is this process that happened in the Western United States after 1860. So how was land distributed prior to that?
On the lands we're talking about, it really wasn't. It stayed federal lands.
I guess I'm thinking about the Eastern United States, the Eastern half of the United States.
That's a whole other story, but I'll summarize it in hopefully 50 words or less. On the Eastern United States, we had after European settlement, we essentially had British colonies. So I just covered 300 years of history right there. No, I'd say 200 years of history. We were set up as colonies, the original New England colonies, and then the colonies along with the southeast coast of what became the United States. So the land belonged to the colonies, and then it was divvied out to individuals and towns and house lots and that kind of thing through the colony laws, and then later on through the state laws. There were a lot of federal lands, but those lands were transferred to the states after the states were formed. Kind of, they like, we'll take, maybe New York State. Okay. At one time, New York State, let's say Pennsylvania, they had state claims that went west from the current boundaries, went west to the Mississippi River. The states dropped those what then were the far western claims, and the federal government then let the states do the land distribution. So it wasn't really a big federal program at the time. And then during the 1860s, and you got to remember, I think it was 1864, America was still in the middle of a civil war. The country was still functioning. This was during President Lincoln's last term. One of the main things was they wanted to have the western lands of the United States develop to provide, like I said, industry that would boost the economy of the country. And at the time, the two main industries, like I said, were agriculture and mining. So there were a number of laws passed in the mid 1860s and into the 1870s that affected homesteading and mining in the West for the next 100 years. So that's kind of sets the stage for.
So was the government okay, we're getting back to the Western United States and homesteading. Was the government actually giving the land away, or did individuals have to pay for the land?
The land was sold at a nominal fee, because the idea was getting the lands into active agricultural production boosted the economy of the country, and that was the value that was there. So the almost the fees they paid were more of a administration fee, like a permit fee, but it wasn't permit. It was a stronger legal document than a permit. So it was a minimal cost, and that was the idea. So the costs would not be an impediment to the settlement of these lands.
And so basically in the East, the way that it was administered varied based on the time and the place and who was distributing the land and whether they were, trying to give people favors with it goes back to the whole colonization of the United States. And this is specific and different what we're talking about with regards to homesteading. So now that we've cleared that up and I understand it.
If we talk a little more on the concept, as you were just discussing, that homesteading was a watershed event in world governments. Most of the European countries were still under some kind of monarchy where lands were owned by the monarch by law. That was part of the American experiment, was that here's a government saying, hey, citizens, we're going to give you land if you go out there and farm it. And that was, that's what was so, at the time it appears, was so startling to the rest of the world.
Did you have to be an American citizen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You had to be American citizen, you had to be over 21, and you had to be an individual or the head of a family, which makes that kind of interesting. There were some restrictions that married women could not homestead because their husbands were expected to. And but there were exceptions. Women could homestead if they were not married or if they were a widow Oh, there's a whole list of things. If the husband became insane, then the wife could pursue the homesteading. And the homestead process, the laws that were passed in 1864, remained in place for about 100 years, up until 1970s. So there was a lot of case law developed through the years on who could homestead and who couldn't. But essentially, you had to be male, over 21 or over, and an American citizen. Those are kind of the very basic requirements to apply for a homestead.
Now, was there a limit on how much land you could get? Like, could one person get more than one homestead?
The original basic unit you could get with a homestead was 160 acres, which was considered a reasonable sized farm. As the homesteading program moved into some of the more arid parts of our West, it was realized that 160 acres of water was not enough land to support, say, some agriculture and a herd of cattle. So
Hmm.
there were expansions, what they call expanded homesteads. Over the years, various laws came through that in certain circumstances you could go up to 640 acres per homestead, which is a square mile. That's
Hmm.
where the acreages kind of came from. But it started out 160 acres.
So
Um,
this was unprecedented in the world, as you said, but it was a great opportunity to basically improve your life, have the American experience in a way that you could only have the American experience.
that's what's so interesting about the whole thing, that again, the American experience.
Right. So I interviewed a local that we both know, Les Mays, and last week, and his family they still own the homestead that they acquired in, I think it was 1870. And his family, like different members of the family, acquired these homesteads. And so if it was, what did you say, 160 acres, there might have
Mhm.
been five relatives that their land bordered each other, and now it's like one big ranch. It's kind of amazing because it's been since 1870, which is why when you gave me choices of things, because you're like a walking encyclopedia about a lot of topics, I chose the homesteading.
I'll go back again, talk a little bit more about the requirements so we can still kind of set the stage for stuff. Besides being 21 or over, a citizen and a head of family, or you could be single, that the requirements were you had like what you did. You went out and marked your prospective property corners with stakes, the outline of what you wanted for your homestead. And that's where the term pulling up stakes, when you leave somewhere, it's an American Western term.
Ah,
And that means you changed your mind, you pulled up your property stakes, and you went somewhere else. So there's a little tidbit there. It wasn't pulling up the stakes to your tent and moving, it was pulling up your property stakes. So anyway, you marked out the acreage you wanted. You went to the local land office. The land office was a government agency, the U.S. official land office. And then you filed paperwork that essentially was a sketch map of the property you wanted, the legal descriptions as far as survey goes. Is the whole thing. It would be township ranged in section and what portion of a section of land is a square mile. By that time, the U.S. government had overlaid the land with a national survey system. And in the land office, they entered the legal description of the land you were applying for in a chronological order in handwritten record books. Okay, after you had filed your application, you had within the 4 years, you had to build a habitable house on the land. You had to cultivate a certain percentage of the acreage the first year, a certain percentage the second year, and a certain percentage the fourth year. It wasn't the whole 160 acres you had to cultivate. There was a percentage. The requirement was you had to cultivate the land, which means you tilled the land and planted something. Your plantings didn't have to be successful. You didn't have to actually have a bumper crop of corn on your land to qualify for the agricultural part of it. You just had to make the effort to plant the stuff and hope it grows. And that was the reason they had the enlarged homesteads later on, because you couldn't grow enough on some of our western lands. Um, so anyway, there was an agricultural component. You had to live in the house for a certain number of the years. And then a government inspector, when felt you were ready, your time had passed, the government inspector would come out and look at your house and would look at your efforts to do agricultural work and make a decision whether you should get your homestead or not. And the inspector was from, like I said, the U.S. General Land Office, or GLO. The inspector would, in most cases, approve, yeah, you've done the work. They would sign off on a government form, and you would pay the fee. And then you own the land. Then you were issued what's called a patent from the U.S. government, and that's a deed. So that you essentially own the land as a private individual. It was not government land anymore. And so that's kind of how the process worked.
So that would take about 4 years?
Yes. You could get an extension of time, but usually most people didn't, because when we were in the Great Plains of the United States country, because that was very good farmland, not as good as the stuff in the East. But it was always a lot of work. Talking about your example of the family you're talking with, that you have a family that they could file adjoining homesteads. They ended up with, the families could be amassing many, many more acres of land by having the family members who were over 21, U.S. citizens, et cetera, filing adjacent homesteads. And then as the family lands would merge, in later years after it was private land, because the government had no control of the land anymore at that time. The only exception to that, some of the homesteads would have exceptions on what was granted to the homesteader. They would get the surface of the land, but this is in later years, when the government realized the value of minerals like oil and gas, that the federal government would reserve the rights to the oil and gas underneath these homestead lands. So the homesteader would get the surface, the right to farm it, all the other rights of private land, except the government would retain the rights to the oil and gas, or the government would retain the rights to run what were called ditches and canals, because at the time, again, in the 1800s, it was always envisioned that canals would remain a major form of transportation, unless you think back to the Erie Canal in upstate New York and whatever and all that stuff, that it was important to reserve the right for the government to build a canal if it needed it, which really didn't happen much in the West, but those rights were still reserved through the federal government. And then if someone's doing research on their land through the government records, the old General Land Office records, which are now maintained by the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, which is part of the U.S. Department of the Interior, you will see the land was transferred, but with the reservation of mineral estate, or, like I said, canals, ditches, other things like that.
So were there designated areas, like not all of the eastern or western United States was open to homesteading? Did the government choose specific, plots of lands to open up?
Yeah, it was kind of the other way around, though. The government chose specific areas of land not to open up, but the majority of it was open at one time or another. So that we spanned essentially a century of time here. So when the federal government decided to create national parks, the national parks were closed to homesteading. And if there was some other reason that the government wanted to keep the land as federal land, early on it would be like the sites of government forts in the West that they decided, these are going to stay federal lands because there's a federal use for them. They were not opened up to homesteading. And then in the early 1900s, when we created our national forest system, the national forests were removed from being available for homesteading. And other things like that. There were there were national monuments. There were some of the Western forts developed in the large military training areas. So those areas were off limits to homesteading.
What about a place like Georgetown when I know the Griffith brothers came here and they staked their claim? How did this land, was this a homestead?
No, there was a parallel effort, the same idea to get lands into private hands, to create industry, to develop the country. That evolved into the mining claim programs that the federal government had, where if an individual, again, U.S. citizen, but you didn't have to be head of a family, U.S. citizen over 21, you could file a mining claim on federal lands if you felt you had discovered a valuable mineral. And usually that was the metallic minerals, silver, gold, involved in the molybdenum, which is very important to Clear Creek County, where we live, sands, or whatever. But if you had discovered a unique mineral on federal land, you could file what they call a mining claim because you intend to mine. The legal background of that is why it's called a claim. It was an individual claim against, not adversarial against, but a claim against government ownership. Okay, so you're a prospector wandering around the Rocky Mountains, and you see some quartz rock sticking out of the ground, and you say, oh, there may be some gold mixed in with that. Again, you could file what's called a mining claim, similar to the homesteading. And if you proved that there really was a valuable mineral there, you could get a private ownership of that land through a mining claim patent as opposed to a homesteading patent. But the mining claim patents had evolved. They were generally 5-acre claims, not the 160. Things evolved later on. That was kind of legalized or codified is the word they use, code from the word code. Codified in the 1873. I'm not exactly. Anyway, between 1873 and 1874, that was codified as U.S. mining law. And that law is still in effect. That's what the folks were doing with the 1860 mining claims here in Clear Creek County. That was when it really started, because the main discovery, the early discovery was 1859. So that essentially that was how a mining claim was established. If you proved up on the claim that you had a valuable mineral, you could get ownership of the claim as private land, again, for a minimal fee, because the idea was to get these mines into production, producing minerals, and improving the U.S. economy. So that was kind of the overall thing on mining claims.
So did they have to be productive in 4 years like the homesteads?
No, you could do it faster. You saw a rock outcrop, you whacked away with your pick and chunks of gold came out, which hardly ever happened. But you could apply for your patent right there because you've proven that there was a valuable mineral there. But on the other hand, mining, hard rock mining, digging mining tunnels, adits, whatever, takes time. So in the meantime, you would file your claim. And if you did a monetary value of work on that claim every year, you could keep working on that claim as an unpatented claim because you hadn't proven yet that there was gold there, say. So you couldn't get the patent, but you could continue that as an unpatented claim. And that would be as long as you work the claim every year, a certain amount of time, or it evolved if you paid a certain amount of money to the federal government in lieu of doing the actual work. You could keep that unpatented claim, but it only gave you the right to mine that land. You didn't own it yet.
Oh, this sounds like a whole other show just talking about mining.
Oh, yes.
So, I guess what I was getting at with that question was, so then the Griffith brothers, they got their 5 acres or whatever. They staked their claim up here. But then how did the town get laid out and how did people acquire ownership of the lots here? Because we were divided into lots as opposed to, 160 acres. How did that, is that part of homesteading or no?
Again, that was a similar program. It was essentially called the town site program with the federal government, and they were separate town site laws. Again,
Oh,
for the idea of getting the land settled. And
oh,
then that,
okay.
so if you wanted to create a town and you're dealing with federal land at the time, that you had to form a committee, or usually it was prominent citizens of a mining camp, say. They were camping on federal land. Maybe they weren't on their mining claims, but they were close to them.
So like the Griffith brothers would have did that
Yeah,
here. Okay.
yeah. If they and their friends decided they wanted to form a town, they would form a committee, would apply to the federal government again through the General Land Office, essentially saying, we want to form a town. Okay. And then they would lay out the proposed boundaries of the town so you could have a legal land description. They would file that application with the General Land Office. This is the same office where the homesteads were filed and where the mining claims were filed. If they followed the process, the federal government would grant the federal lands would be granted to that group for the town. So then a town organization had to be created, and then that town, and they're called trustees, they're called the town trustees. The town would usually survey the land in the land lots, and then the town trustees would either sell or transfer, give away the lots to the people who wanted to live in town. So, and that's happened all over the West.
That's a whole other show too.
That certainly is.
So we have gone off. I've put you off the path, but I was curious about all that. Do you feel like you explained homesteading enough to move into more specifics?
I think what I'll do now is, as I said, these laws were on the books until the 1970s. The homesteading laws, among other things, were repealed in the mid 1970s. At that time, I happened to be working for the Bureau of Land Management in Alaska. We've stated I'm a forester, and I also dealt with what they call realty matters for the federal government. I was a federal land law adjudicator at the time, and I got involved with the transfer of federal lands to Native Americans in Alaska. When the homesteading laws were repealed in the 1970s, they gave a 10-year extension of them to Alaska, which put it into the mid 1980s. That you could still homestead under the same laws in Alaska. Well, one of my jobs was going into the field and verifying on the homestead application, verifying that they had done all the requirements, and then making a decision on whether that homestead should be granted or not. I went to one homestead, and The house were living in was a school bus. And okay, they've been living there for like 4 years, so it was at home. And I said to him, well, why did you pick this particular spot for your homestead? And they said, oh, that's where the bus broke down.
Oh my goodness.
So sometimes this land selection process was kind of serendipitous.
Wow.
So that was kind of fun. But that was very interesting work. And no matter anyone who homesteaded and proved up and was successful, you knew they had put a heck of a lot of work in what they accomplished. It was a
Yeah.
major accomplishment to do this in 1860s and a major accomplishment
Sure.
in the
Yeah.
1970s.
Specific stories. Do you have other specific stories or particular stories that you find compelling about homesteaders?
I think the major thing that impressed me was the determination of the people involved to go through this process in their own land as a landowner. I don't have any particular list of stories to tell. What's interesting about this whole thing is was in such an amazing process that a governmental body would decide to essentially give away or sell land at a very low price to
Hmm.
develop the nation's economy. It was a whole different approach to a country's economic policies that
Sure.
had not happened in the world much before.
Do you think it was a success based on what the hoped for outcome would be? Do you think it was successful?
Oh, well, yeah. Here we are. We're at I mean, no, the economy in the United States goes up and down. It's cyclic, like any economy. But we're a country with a robust, over the long run, very robust, still a developing economy, and that was the objective. And the homesteading process and the mining process in the township all contributed to making that happen.
Are there homesteads in Colorado, like near us, that you're aware of?
One of the provisions of the homesteading laws that homesteads could not be on land that was valuable for minerals.
Okay.
So, in our county and the Front Range counties of Colorado, where it was known mineral deposits after they were discovered, there were very few homesteads, like say in Clear Creek County that we live in, Gilpin County, the next one to us, because most of it was recognized as mining land. They weren't agricultural. So in Clear Creek County, I think there was a homestead in what's known as the Evergreen area on the eastern part of our
Uh-huh.
county, which is flatter valley, mountain
Hmm.
valley, but flatter valley land that that you could actually grow crops in, on a large scale. And so I think there's at least one homestead in that area of the eastern part of Clear Creek County. But generally, our county here was so mountainous that you couldn't do successful agriculture. So most of the private land in our county and similar counties either went to private hands through the mining laws with mining claims
Hmm.
or through the township laws that we described earlier. There's another factor in there too, that when our American Western territories became states, the federal government gave a certain amount of acres of federal land to the states. And and then the state could subsequently either sell that land or they could retain the ownership. Here in Colorado and other western states, a lot of the states kept the lands they got from the federal government as state lands to manage and produce money for the school systems. They're called school lands. So, and then there were lands within our Front Range counties that say went to the state and then went to private ownership or stayed with state ownership.
Well, you are really a walking encyclopedia. So where do we see homesteading? I always ask my guests this in pop culture. The first thing I think of course, is that movie. Was it called Far and Away with Tom Cruise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was about homesteading, right?
Uh, I have to say I'm not really familiar with that movie.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to do some more research, but because
Yeah.
I like to link out in my episode page to where do we find this history in pop culture?
Yeah. I would say in pop culture it's the Western theme of determination and grit to get out there and build your house and plant your farm and become a success in spite of all adversarial weather and terrain and whatever happened to be going on politically at the time and that kind of thing.
Right, right.
It's that determination that we're going to get this done no matter what.
Why is
Yeah.
this history important to you? Why does it resonate with you?
Uh, well, again, because it was part of my uh, experiences with the. I was very lucky to be involved with the what we can call the tail end of the homesteading saga of America, and that I find that very what's the word I want pleasing, I guess, to myself that I got a chance to be involved with that because when you look at the this whole spread of it, it's such a unique and wonderful thing that happened in our country, and it's
It
great.
is. It's the narrative of the American dream,
Hmm.
really. And what is the most important thing you would like to leave our listeners with about homesteading?
I would say that it's an example of what people can accomplish when they put their minds to it, and that it was a where it's not a program anymore,
Yeah.
but it exemplifies the determination and the drive of the settlers of our country, and that's I think is just the example it sets. That if you have want to achieve something, you work at it, and there's a high percentage that you will succeed. So I think
Yeah.
that's that's kind of it. Yeah.
That's a good answer. Okay. Well, that was very informative, Frank. Thank you so
No.
much.
Well,
Uh,
I just hope it's not completely boring to most people.
no,
That's
I think
probably.
that it's a lot of good information. There's a lot of details in there that I didn't know about. I still have a lot of questions about other parts of it. So I think I'm going to have to bring you back to talk about maybe, you know, particularly our town. I don't know, something, because I think it's fascinating. I'm sure that our listeners will think so as well. So are there homesteads today that, well, I know there are because my friend Les's family has had a homestead from the beginning and it continues to be passed down.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, because it's private land. It's
right.
um,
Are there many of those, do you think?
oh, I would say yes. That's why how some of the larger ranches all over the West got established and are still in the families. Of course, a lot of them now are subdivided and sold as they've become part of suburban areas, but
Yeah.
there's still a lot left. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. That's interesting.
And then we could always talk about that everything I've been talking about does not apply to Texas.
Really?
Because Texas declared itself a republic when that's why they had the Mexican War with the Alamo and all that,
Uh-huh.
is that Texas was not a territory. It's like, say, Colorado was,
Okay.
uh, Arizona, or those places. Texas had declared itself a republic and then decided to join the Union and become a state directly without being a territory first. And
Well, what's
so
the difference between a republic and a territory?
a republic is a sovereign government.
Oh, so it was like its own country.
Yeah. hmm And there was
Okay.
no federal land.
So the whole time, oh, okay. It was
So
all state land.
all the federal land laws didn't apply. So yeah, it was like it was all state land.
Interesting. So much history to talk about, and that's what I'm here for. So,
You're doing you're doing a good job.
oh, you're so sweet. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the podcast too. Frank Young, thank you so much for being here today.
You're quite welcome, Anne Marie. It's been enjoyable.
Perfect. And that's a wrap.
Ta-da!
So there you have it. Frank Young and Homesteading in the American West. Be sure to join us next week for part 2 of our series of homesteading, when we talk to Les Mays about his family's personal adventure, homesteading the family ranch, a ranch which is still in the family. This American adventure begins in the 1870s and takes us all the way till today. Thanks for joining us. I hope you have a great week.